Yeah, with this tariff stuff, it's just update. I remember, boom, he first came out with the billboard, all these countries, and then China comes in with the retaliating tariffs, and then Trump's like, all right, we're bringing it up to 125, and then they match it. And it's like, all right, 250. So it's always kind of going, but everyone's kind of worried with all this stuff going on and all this unpredictability. What do you make of all this?
Well, what's going on right now is unprecedented, as far as I can see, in the history of economic policy, certainly in the history of trade policy. And so, what can you make of it? As you rightly said, there's an immense amount of noise. It's very unpredictable. We don't really know what policy will be tomorrow. It depends on the influences upon him. So, I think essentially we can make the following: the general shift is protectionist. The details are constantly changing, and that unpredictability is itself a very important part of the policy environment. And so, what we know is that the world economy is disintegrating inevitably as a result of this, but we also don't know where it's going to end up. And we know that business in this environment can't really make rational decisions, so they're frozen. That's enough. We already know these things, and that's very significant. And we probably know that it's likely to stay like this for nearly another 4 years, maybe longer. It'll do a lot of damage.
A lot of people are kind of bashing Trump. We've spoken to a lot of economists who some of them say, well, well, no one really knows if he has a strategy. No one's in his head, obviously. But a lot of people are saying that he is not being smart with his economics and that his tariffs are a detriment to the American economy. And I was seeing yesterday already, the IMF announced that the predicted growth of the US is now going down. What do you think of his tariff strategy, if it is a strategy? And is there some upside? And some people also say that this could be there's been a downfall in American manufacturing. Something has to change, and maybe a drastic change is what we're seeing and is what needs to be done. So what do you think?
Well, very much a critic, but I think one has to separate out different elements of this story. So, and the big ones are, do the goals make sense? Second, if you had these goals, would you use tariffs? Would that be your main instrument? And the third is, and if you were to introduce tariffs, would you introduce them in this way? These are three very different aspects of it. I think that there is an argument to be made that, from my perspective, that the global economy needs rebalancing, in the sense that, and it was part of my book on the financial crisis. I wrote a book, which I think was published in 2014, called The Shifts and the Shocks, maybe it was a year earlier, which was on the financial crisis. And in discussing why the global financial crisis happened, the big collapse of the banks in 2007 to 9, I argued that an important element in that story was the so-called global imbalances. What did that mean? Well, a number of economies, and probably the most important were China and Germany, built their growth. There are others, but they're the most important. Built their growth in the early part of this century around export surpluses. It was particularly clear with China. Its current account surplus peaked at 10% of GDP, which is an enormous number for such a big economy. I think it's 2008, roughly then. And of course, if a country is running huge surpluses, somebody else has to run deficits. And the country that is most able to run large deficits to offset these huge surpluses is the US, by definition, because it creates the international currency. So people are very happy to hold it, and it's very big. So the combination of those two realities means that it can run deficits, which are big in relationship to its economy, and huge in dollar terms, more than anybody else. And it ended up running the countervailing deficits. And that was how the global economy was balanced in terms of macroeconomics, demand and supply, if you like. That's one way of thinking about it. And the problem was that in order for this to happen, the private sector or the public sector of the US had to run huge financial deficits. That's just a matter of logic. They're the counterpart of the huge current account deficits or capital account surpluses. They're the same thing, two sides of the same coin. They were the counterpart. And up to the financial crisis, they ran huge private sector deficits, financial deficits. And after that, they ran huge fiscal deficits. Now, what that means is that they were accumulating debt. First, it was private sector debt, and then it was government debt. And when the private sector debt got too big, most of that was basically in the internal sector. Internally, it was bank debt and other forms of private sector debt, corporate and household. When they got too much, there was a crisis because people thought all these borrowers in the US are not actually solvent. They're not creditworthy. We've got to stop lending to them. And we had a financial crisis. The private borrowing collapsed, the financial sector collapsed, and the government replaced them. And so you can argue, and I do think that these global imbalances played a very large part in generating the financial crisis in the US. That was the biggest effect. There's a secondary effect, which you mentioned, which is that if you're running a huge current account deficit, you have to run a large trade deficit, more or less. And in the US, the trade deficit was in goods, right? Services account has always been very strong. The US is very strong in export of services. So basically, the US lost a huge amount of production in labor-intensive manufactures. Now, my view is that was real, it was significant, but most of those activities were going to go anyway. And because the US just doesn't have a comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturers, they were not going to go on making simple clothing, textiles, and a lot of other assembly jobs. They just weren't competitive. What the US failed to do was realize how quickly this was happening. They could have used safeguard protection as a way of managing that. They didn't. And they didn't really provide any place-based policies to help the affected areas. Similar things happened in Europe, happened in Britain too, but earlier, mostly earlier in the 80s. They didn't, to help people through this shock. So there were two sides of, if you like, the global imbalances, the huge trade surpluses, and the change in comparative advantage. One was the financial weakness, and the second was the shift in manufacturing. Now, I think those are realities, and they were very badly handled, and they had very real consequences. So that's the first point. There are genuine problems. Now, the question then is, would tariff protection be the best way of dealing with these problems? Now, here, there are, the answer is no, in my view, very clearly, but I think we have to say why, and I will separate out the two dimensions of the problem. Imposing tariff protection does not of itself solve balance of payments deficits. A trade deficit, there are complexities here in how you deal with GDP accounts, and I'm going to ignore those for the purposes of this discussion. Doesn't really make huge difference. But basically, if you run a huge current account deficit, that means that spending in your economy exceeds output in your economy. That's true by definition. So when you're running a current account deficit, it means that the spending of residents, well, more or less, the spending of residents exceeds national income, okay? And that creates a deficit. It's just another way of saying you've got excess spending. Do tariffs affect this? No, not. They only affect it to the extent that tariff revenue leads to a reduction in the fiscal deficit. So there is an effect there, but it's not huge. Ultimately, you have to, and of course, you could generate revenue in other ways. But ultimately, spending and income have to be brought closer together if you want to reduce your current account deficit. So the main impact of the tariff is that it shifts the composition of the sectors of your economy producing tradable goods and services. This is quite complicated, but broadly speaking, if you raise tariffs, you will shrink your imports, you will increase the size of your import competing sector, but in the process of shrinking the size of your import competing sector, you will certainly shrink your exporting sector. And you can see this directly and indirectly. I can't go through all the mechanisms because it takes a while. But essentially what happens is, so your import competing, relatively less competitive sector grows. The exporting sector is adversely affected by the shift in the exchange rate, which will tend to appreciate once you reduce imports.
Yeah, and the dollar has fallen.
The dollar's falling is I think a temporary process. In the long run, the real exchange rate will appreciate, and it will because you simply need less imports. That's not true overnight. That's true over several years. And of course, in addition, the inputs that exports use, much of which is manufacturers, will cost more because you've got huge tariffs on them. And that will shrink your export competing sectors, which use tradable inputs. So the net effect, I think, will be overwhelmingly not to reduce the current account deficit. As I pointed out in one column, if you look across the world, countries with very high protection often run huge current account deficits. They're not affected by protection because you have to adjust income and expenditure. But you will change the composition of your tradable goods and services sector in the direction of the less competitive parts, because that's what import competing firms are. Firms that are competing with imports tend to be less competitive than the firms that are overwhelmingly competitive in exports, because they are, by definition, really competitive. So you shift the production of your tradable goods and services sector towards less competitive sectors. You don't increase them overall. And while you might increase to some extent employment in your manufacturing sector, it will be offset by losses elsewhere in agriculture, in services, and in parts of your exporting sector. So if you have a problem like this, you need to rebalance demand and spending in your economy, which in the case of the US means worldwide. I'll come to how you will do that later on. But tariffs on their own will not fix this problem. We know that. We've known that as economists for half a century or more, actually, much longer. Then the final question is, let's suppose you wanted you do want to use tariffs, so you want them to be effective in order to get people to invest in import competing industry. Let's assume you ignore everything I said for, you want to do that. Then what you have to do is impose tariffs, do them in a sensible way. We can discuss what that would look like. It wouldn't look like individual tariffs against every country in the world. They will be overall, because you don't want to create lots of distortions in relative prices between the imports coming from every single country in the world. Just think how complicated it would be to work out, well, who's going to be supplying me with this good? Is it going to come from Germany, or is it going to come from Japan? They're all going to have different tariffs in the Trump formulation, which is really ridiculous. You just want a uniform tariff, and you want it to stay. So the standard way of doing this will be to impose a uniform tariff, probably. There are some qualifications to that. And you then say, well, this is the tariff in the next 15 years. And then you decide to invest. None of that's has happened. So my view is it's not a reasonable objective. It's not, the tariff is not an effective instrument, and the way they're doing tariffs is a complete mess. Should they do? This is the last thing, since you asked these most fundamental of questions. What they should have done is say, who are the countries running huge surpluses? The most important are, in fact, China, Germany, Japan. Germany and Japan are allies.
India?
No, it's relatively small. The current account surplus of India is pretty trivial. In fact, I don't think it has a current account surplus. I think it has a current account deficit, but that I haven't looked the last year or two. There are some number of smaller rich countries. Switzerland has a huge one. Singapore has a huge one, but it's very small relative to the world. It's huge relative to the economy. Only big countries really matter for this purpose. And then what you would say is, we're going to put a tax on the exports of China and of Germany, or on the capital exports, that will be even easier, of these countries into, say, the US. And we will keep that tax on the capital imports of these countries until they introduce policies designed to reduce their current account surplus. Now, that will be a targeted, clear policy. Some of my friends have argued for this. Even quite classical economists have argued for this. And that would make sense. That would be, whether it will work, whether it would change the policies of these countries, I don't know, but it would be targeted at the real problem, which is the global imbalances, I think. And then you would introduce subsidies and or very targeted protection to support the industries that you decide are really high priority. High priority for security reasons, for employment reasons, whatever they are. You would have to decide who they are, and you'd decide the priority in relationship to your policies and your priorities, not in relationship to what you think everybody else is doing. And you certainly wouldn't pay the slightest attention to bilateral balances,